Welcome to What the Duck, a podcast with real experts talking about direct spend challenges and experiences. And now, here's your host, SourceDay's very own manufacturing maven, Sarah Scudder.
Thanks for joining me for What the Duck, another supply chain podcast brought to you by SourceDay. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and this is the podcast for people working in the direct materials part of supply chain. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S Scudder on Twitter. If you are new to the show, make sure to follow this podcast so you don't miss any of our direct materials supply chain content. Today, I'm going to be joined by Miguel Cossio, and we're going to discuss why supplier collaboration strategies fail and what you can do about it. If you work for a manufacturer and are struggling to collaborate with your suppliers, then this episode is for you. Miguel is a research director in the supply chain operations team at Gartner. He focuses on helping procurement leaders deliver greater value by adapting to the latest trends in supplier collaboration and innovation, performance management, and sustainable procurement. Miguel has 14 years industry experience in direct materials, plus 6 years as an analyst advising clients in direct procurement. Welcome to the show, Miguel.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
I'd like to start off by having you describe yourself in one sentence.
That's a challenging question. In one sentence. And I'm not going to give you the typical response that you would put on a resume. I am a person who loves... that's very hard. I guess I'm just someone who really enjoys his work. I love to collaborate with people. I am passionate about procurement. Procurement happened to me. It's not that I chose procurement, and I'm sure we're going to get to that. And being a Gartner analyst, I just get to share, understand what makes people tick, figure out how to help them. And that's just who I am. Nothing extraordinary there. So as you can see in the background, I like to play the guitar when my little ones let me. And I like to go fishing, not very good at it, but I like to go fishing. I play tennis, and that's pretty much it.
So given the guitar hanging behind you, what type of music do you play?
I like finger picking, so anything from Fleetwood Mac to Mark Knopfler to Tracy Chapman. So I come from a family of musicians. My dad was, he's still alive, but he no longer plays, but he was like you can find records of him on Spotify and everything in Mexico.
Okay. Yeah, so I moved to Austin about 14 months ago and I joined the SourceDay team, and I'm now into country music.
Yeah.
I figured I'm living in Texas. I need to be a true Texan, so I'm used to my Spotify and Pandora now is all country western and didn't used to be. Miguel, why direct procurement? That's a common theme throughout your career.
So I guess I started as in a corporate headquarters procurement, working alongside a lot of different category managers, people working in direct. I was originally on the IT side of supporting them, different IT solutions that I was coding myself. And all of a sudden I took an interest on direct procurement. To me, direct procurement, procurement is one of those functions that has historically not been considered the sexiest. And I think it's just, there's so much we can do in procurement, right? The impact in a good procurement organization is just significant. And specifically on the direct side, you become an expert on whatever you're buying, right? So I used to buy glass, heating elements that you use for your refrigerator or your stoves. I used to buy compressors, whatever, right? So you get to be very hands-on in terms of the engineering, the how is it manufactured, how is it made, and that's just very different than if you're buying consulting services, right? So it's, I guess that's the engineering me that always drove me to stay in direct procurement.
So let's get a little bit personal. I want to start with the very beginning of your career. You started as a program manager.
Yep.
So let's talk a little bit about your journey there.
So I was actually still in school, starting my undergraduate degree, and I was in IT, computer systems engineering. And in the middle of that, as I was doing my studies, I joined one of the largest appliances manufacturers in Mexico that sells millions of appliances in Latin America and in the US. And I joined them as an intern on IT. And pretty much one of the biggest things I worked as a program manager there was creating a system where you could like create POs and like communicate with your ERPs. And I was this junior person pulling all the factories in, making sure that you have the right systems in place, etc. So I know if you think about digitizing procurement, I've done it from scratch, and I think it's a key enabler, right? But that's how I started, and then the more I got into like direct procurement, the more I got interested in as I was on the IT side, right? But I was very much working alongside category managers, and that's where I just started picking up in my different categories of spend.
And then after you spent a few years as a program manager, you moved into a role at GE Appliances as a sourcing manager. So what were you responsible for, and what did you learn in this role?
So as program manager, I actually moved I was still in the same company, but now as category manager, right? So that was before GE Appliances. And this is a company that back then was a joint venture, partially owned by GE. And in this company in Mexico, I was in charge of buying plastic parts. Then I moved to glass, heating elements, and extrusion, like very different. Think about your appliances that are in your kitchen, and pretty much like almost everything that makes up an appliance went through that for a certain period of time, right? And then from there, I was sent over to GE Appliances as a liaison between both organizations, because at the end, GE Appliances had their own procurement team. And we also had this like joint venture in Mexico, where I was coming from, who also had a procurement team, right? So I pretty much was responsible for everything that this Mexican company was selling to GE, which was slightly over 2 million appliances on a yearly basis. Any supply chain issue, I was the person that would go to figure out what's going on, what are we doing about it, et cetera, et cetera. So that was one part of the job. And the other part was really identifying synergies, right? Where can we get the procurement team across the two companies to join forces and drive cost optimization, innovation, you name it, right? Different suppliers.
What was the most important thing you learned in your role at GE Appliances?
Very good question. So the art of communication, right? So really understanding what is the problem. Like you have to think about the next 5 questions your senior leadership team is going to ask you, right? So there's a problem, material stock anywhere, or whatever it is, right? Capacity constraints. So you have to not only understand the problem and figure out like what are the actions that we are taking, like or that are being put in place to address that issue. You have to anticipate what are the questions that your senior leadership is going to ask, and make sure that you come to a meeting knowing what are the next 5 things that they are likely going to ask, and keeping that balance between being tactical when you have to be tactical and give details to saying, don't worry, we have this, and like that to me was one of the major things I learned.
And then I find it interesting. So in all these roles, you were involved in manufacturing, right? That's another theme, direct, and then the manufacturing piece. Then you transitioned into what I would consider a pretty different role. You actually moved and went to work for Gartner. So why the change? Why did you want to transition into more of an analyst consultant role?
That's a very good question. So what happened is I had a lot of years of experience in direct procurement, in manufacturing, in appliances, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, it was almost very industry focused, right? And I wanted to either make a change from a functional perspective, right? Move into product management or something different, or expand my experience to other industries. And Gartner gave me that perfect opportunity, because right now I'm working with companies in CPG, in aerospace and defense, in the airline industry, like you name it, right? So it's very interesting seeing how the challenges are similar, but like you cannot talk the same way as you would advise a company in CPG to versus a company that's making submarines, right? It's very different, right? So It's almost like the ability to expand your knowledge and also the ability to like properly do analysis, right? Figure out what is hurting people, like where are they hurting and what are the things that they can do to overcome, right? Like almost like a center of excellence, but on steroids, right? Where you get to do this with pulling insights from not just within your own company, but all different sorts of industries.
It's like my love for startups. I've always worked for startups in supply chain, and I think it's because I like to do lots of different things. I think I would get pretty bored if I had one very specific role that I was just focused on and doing every day. I can definitely relate to that. So you play or you do work on the indirect and the direct side. Our
Correct.
podcast is solely focused on direct. What do you like most about working with people on the direct side?
I think from an ownership perspective, right? Like people who are on the direct side, in an ideal state, they own the strategy, right? The sourcing strategy, the category strategy. They're the ones who do this right. They're the ones pulling different stakeholders into the mix, right? And they almost have like this glue that brings everybody together to make sure that we move forward. On the indirect side, I think it's extremely important, but the role that procurement plays, it's more about convincing others that, hey, we can add value. Like you're coming in from a very different place, and at the end, I don't think you really own that, right? It's most likely that your stakeholders know more about those suppliers than you. So it depends on the category that we're speaking of. But that, generally speaking, I would say that's the ownership perspective is one thing that continues to really catch my attention from the direct side.
I started my career on the indirect side, and I always describe it to people as doing lots of selling. You're always out selling and trying to get buy-in, where on the direct side, you have the buy-in, so it's more about strategy and optimization.
Correct. And it's just pulling people together rather than trying to convince them that why are you there in the first place.
That's right. So, Miguel, in prepping for our interview today, we talked a lot about supplier collaboration. And you mentioned that one of the most important things a manufacturer can do to optimize their direct material spend is to collaborate with suppliers. Why is that?
So I don't think it's just spend. Generally speaking, to win, to be able to reach your goals, whatever they are, if it's cost, service, innovation, sustainability, you need to collaborate with suppliers. And when I say collaborate, I'm not talking about tactical collaboration or operational collaboration. That's important, right? Having the right systems in place to have that efficient communication with suppliers. But I'm thinking more about the strategic side of collaboration, right? So making sure that, in a nutshell, you're doing everything you can to become a customer of choice for those suppliers, so that when there is capacity constraints or they have an idea for innovation or whatever it is, they're coming to you first and not other. And this is something that I've done in my past life, right? And just really passionate about it, right? So it's funny because as I think back about my career in procurement, I always thought I wasn't the right person, right? Because I really cared about the relationship, right? And everybody I was surrounded with, they were like, no, you just have to squeeze the supplier for the last cent, right? And I'm like, no, the relationship is. So I always thought about myself being quote unquote too soft, right? Because I really cared about the collaboration. So how do we see a lot of companies doing strategies for improving collaboration with suppliers.
And I would argue you described yourself as soft. I don't know if that's the right term, but soft buyers are the ones who won in the last couple of years during COVID.
Absolutely. If anyone hearing this, they're still dipping on the fence thinking about supplier collaboration, this is where the ones that have done it definitely came ahead. I had so many companies reaching out, how can we start doing this in the middle of a pandemic? I'm like, you're too late, right? So you should learn to swim before the boat is sinking, right?
So what are most manufacturers struggling with? So we talk about it, and I think a lot of people are aware of the importance and the benefits, but I think it's a lot harder to actually do, shift culture and shift mindset. So what are most manufacturers struggling with in terms of supplier collaboration?
So I think that brings us to the original reason we said, let's talk. So the whole concept of why is our supplier collaboration strategies or initiatives failing? And that's something I'm actively doing, like pulling all of the insights I've learned in the last 6 years of speaking to hundreds of companies on this, right? And I came up with 6 very specific things, right, that we can go into depending on where we want to focus. But the first thing is a lot of companies simply don't have a strategy. Right. I've spoken to very large companies that think they have this right. And when I ask them, what is your strategy? How do you know what you're doing with which suppliers? Why? What are the goals, etc.? And there's no strategy. And that's a very risky position to be in, because saying it's just who we are, we collaborate with suppliers, can get you halfway there. But the moment there's a leadership change, that's all gone. I've read books of companies like claiming to have great supplier collaboration strategies 20 years ago, and now I'm speaking to them because they're trying to get this started from scratch. So that, to me, the not having a strategy is one of the biggest things. But if we move beyond that, and let's assume you already have a strategy and what are manufacturers struggling with, we have been running a series of surveys in the last 3 years, and the top 3 things I can say come up is, one is the lack of resources, right? And this is based on the latest survey that we did earlier this year, right? So 88% of companies told us we don't have the resources to do this.
And when you
right?
say resources, are you meaning lack of people, or what does that mean?
It's people, time, technology. So we actually asked for those, and it's the challenge that most are being faced is when there's a fire, and we've been putting out fires for the last 3 years. This simply has just been put to the back burner. Supplier collaboration, like proactively driving this and holding your top-to-top meetings and doing like the typical elements of a supplier collaboration strategy. People are struggling to find time to do this, right? Because they're being pulled into just keeping everything afloat, right? So that's one of the major things that I think companies have been struggling. The 2 next big things, and I think these top 3 are highly relevant, is the lack of internal stakeholder support, right? So stakeholders are pushing back and they're saying like, what is it that we're doing? And there's many things that happen with that, right? So it could be from simply from a branding perspective, right? So most companies or people talk about this as SRM, right? Let's face it, SRM is one of those terms that people might not simply understand, right? Or they might think, oh, it's scorecarding or it's supplier management. So the cultural details internally within your organization, if you feel like stakeholders are pushing back. And I've seen a lot of companies that just simply don't call it SRM. They call it Supplier Excellence Program or Partner to Win or Win-Win Way, or Kellogg's has one called...
What you're saying is branding matters, and what you name
branding matters. Yeah, and if you say SRM and everybody's happy, then go with that. But if you see some people saying like cringing and saying, you have to change, you have to think about the branding of the program. So that's one of the things that happens with stakeholders. And the other is, when you think about procurement teams, if you go out and speak to one stakeholder in R&D and talk about cost, right, they don't care as much as cost as you. So people have to think about, as they're trying to overcome this huge challenge, which is stakeholder buying, they have to think about what's in it for the stakeholders and how are they going to bring them into the process, etc. Right? So first challenge is lack of resources. Second one is stakeholders pushback. And the third one, which many companies just, I don't know if they just don't think about this or they choose not to think about it, but it's suppliers are skeptical, right? So a lot of companies are going to say, we're going to do a supplier collaboration strategy. These are my top 20 strategic suppliers, and they're just going to be thrilled that we're calling them strategic. No, because most likely someone else, your competitor, already reached out to that same supplier, called them strategic, and nothing happened. So I would say 90% of the strategy documents I reviewed from different companies who are trying to do this, when I look at their deck and what the program entails, etc., 90% simply forget to include what's in it for the supplier. And if you cannot clearly define what is the value for the suppliers are still going to give you your BT. They're going to tell you they're your strategic customer, but they're not going to show you that you're strategic.
So in marketing, this is a challenge as well. I talk to marketers who have never spoken to a customer. And I would argue, how can you do marketing if you don't know what your customers are talking about and what they care about? So it sounds like this is similar in that you've seen companies put strategies in place and have never spent time to sit down and talk with suppliers and listen to what they care about and what matters to them.
And most people will say we have top-to-top meetings. Yeah, that has some value, right? But it would be way more valuable for you to say, hey, we're going to do risk and sharing with some of these strategic suppliers. Now we're talking about real benefits for the supplier, right? Or we're going to sign better agreements with them that are not as onerous on them as we typically are. So that's real value for the suppliers. So thinking, if you have a strategy and it's failing, one of the key things is to figure out, like, are we really offering suppliers something that's their worth, right? But those would be the top three things.
So it almost sounds like setting up some sort of focus group where you're actually sitting down in person or remotely talking to suppliers, getting feedback, getting input, maybe even running some ideas by them could go a long way in setting this strategy.
Could be, but it's not necessarily a success factor, right? So I'm completely sold on the idea that we need to collect feedback from suppliers, right? In terms of how good are we as a customer, what are the things we need to improve, etc., right? But coming up with how are we, if we call a supplier strategic, what does that mean that has value for them? You don't need to speak to the supplier. It's like, you just have to do your homework. And guess what? It's not just about giving them more volume, right? Because a lot of people say they just want business. Not necessarily, right? So maybe even the way that you're measuring their performance, right? If you're just measuring their performance based on cost, quality, and service, what about everything they're doing in terms of risk and resilience, or everything they're doing in terms of innovation and sustainability, and not making sure that you're capturing all of the value that they're bringing to the table? You don't need to ask them anything. They're doing that for you. You just have to show them that you are quantifying that in the way that you're doing decisions, so that when a new supplier comes in that's way cheaper than them, you're not going to take business away because that new supplier is not providing the right value.
So we have some listeners to the show that are actually buyers. So they're in the doing role, not necessarily the management and leadership role. What can a buyer do to help get a successful supplier collaboration program in place?
What is their role? Okay, so first of all, we have to define buyer, right? Is the buyer the one cutting the POs and maybe sending the forecast and all of that good stuff? That's great. Some companies call buyers their category managers, right? The ones creating the strategy, etc., right? So if you're a buyer and you're in a manufacturing side and you are the one like dealing day to day with a supplier, as you're thinking about supplier collaboration, is first you need to challenge your procurement team, right? Making sure that you're saying like we think these are our most important suppliers. You need to make it very clear to your procurement team, what is it that you need from suppliers? It could be, most likely it's going to be something around service, right? Consignment stock or responsiveness, whatever. But you clearly have to define what is it that you need and make sure that procurement is incorporating those needs into the way that they're assessing suppliers. I would never recommend someone in a buying role saying we're going to start an SRM program or a supplier collaboration program, because that's usually procurement, just one part of it. You're as important as R&D, as quality, like the different stakeholders. It's procurement that has to pull that together. But if they're not doing it, you need to push them. You need to challenge them. Another thing that I think is important as we think about this supplier collaboration, we see like a lot of companies thinking or implementing CPFR, right? Collaborative planning and replenishment. And the reality is that kind of approach of CPFR, you should be doing it with a handful of suppliers. And if you're a buyer and you're participating in CPFRs, you need to make sure that those suppliers are the ones that are strategic for the business and not just for you as an entity. And that's where another conversation with the procurement team is. Like, you want to avoid being in a position where you call a supplier strategic, procurement calls it like you're bottleneck and you're horrible, we're getting rid of you. Everybody has a different opinion, right? So you need to make sure that you're raising your needs and your priorities to these procurement folks to feed the strategy. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's say I'm starting Sarah Scudder Incorporated. I'm a company that's going to manufacture something or things in the US. Widget, that's right. What does a successful supplier collaboration program look like for me? So I have nothing in place. I want to build something. How would you coach or advise me to do that?
So the first thing is, if you're extremely low maturity and every factory is buying from whoever they want and it's the Wild West out there, don't pursue this, because you're not ready for this. And we need to recognize that, hey, maybe the whole concept of ownership, of making sure that there's strategies in place, et cetera, I think that's a key element to at least consider a supplier collaboration strategy. But assuming you have that, to me, when I'm speaking to companies large and small, and I'm trying to figure out, like, do they have a good supplier collaboration strategy or not, there are a few things that I'm looking for. One is, what is the goal of the strategy, right? So if you tell me we're going to save money, that's not good enough, because again, not everybody cares as much as savings as you do, right? As a buyer, as a procurement person, right? So the goals of the strategy have to be more corporate wide, right? Think about innovation, sustainability, things like that, right? That's one thing. The second thing is, who owns this? If it's only procurement doing this alone, that's a huge mistake, because procurement is going out and doing and promising things, but stakeholders are like, no, I don't agree. So procurement leads, but it's a group with stakeholders. That's the second thing I'm looking for. The third thing I would say I would look for is the scope of the program, right? So there's this, every time I read an article, post or whatever in LinkedIn, people usually say you should do SRM or collaboration with your strategic suppliers. And I always cringe, because yes, I say, yes, you should definitely do that first, and then think about your non-strategic suppliers and what are the things you could do to reach them, right? Because at the end, I've spoken to large companies that have 60,000 suppliers, and I'm not making this number up, right? 60,000 suppliers, out of which 13 are strategic. If 13 suppliers love you, but the rest hate you, you have a problem, right? So yes, you start with your strategic suppliers. Hopefully you're doing a good selection, not too many suppliers, et cetera, but then you create, like, what are the set of mechanisms that we're going to put in place, and think about things like supplier summits, voice of the supplier surveys, recognition awards, right? All of those things that can help us reach more suppliers without having to sit down with them personally, right? So that to me is another big part of what a good strategy would look like.
I also think it's important to define, what does strategic mean? I would argue just because it's your biggest spend does not mean it's a strategic supplier.
Agree.
There could be a supplier where you spend 10 or 20K a year with, but they make a part that is absolutely essential and critical. Without it, you can't produce your product. So I think it's very important to define and look at what is a strategic supplier.
And that's definitely one of the reasons why supplier collaboration strategy failed, right? Because it could be either you have the wrong set of suppliers, right? So you're saying, it's my top spend, they must be very important, so we're going to call them strategic. No, spend has its place, but you have to think about, the easiest way for me to define this is, which are your most valuable suppliers? It doesn't matter about the performance, it doesn't matter their spend. Which are the most valuable suppliers for you? And it depends on your business strategy. It could be you're all in for innovation, you're all in for, like, that definition of value is going to differ, right? And yes, we can set some minimum thresholds for spend, but at the end, it's those valuable suppliers. Then we need to figure out, like, yes, maybe they're strategic. And I'm saying maybe because you might have suppliers that are extremely important for you, right? But you're not very important to them. So in that case, they're critical. They're not strategic. They do belong. Usually, when I talk about segmentation, everybody thinks about the Kralich matrix and the 2x2s, and that's all good. But in practice, most companies that I'm speaking to that do this well usually just have 3 segments. So it's just like the strategic suppliers, the most important, where we're also important to them. The critical, which is very important suppliers, but we're not that important. So it's more like a risk-based approach. And the third, everybody else, the transactional ones, right? So you could have I hear people telling me we have 5 segments, right? And that's what we want to do. That's fine. As long as you can clearly differentiate how you deal with each supplier differently, you can have 7 segments, right? But usually most companies struggle with that. They just say, my segment 1 is this, segment 2 that, and then the rest we just treat them the same. So why are you even segmenting them? It's a waste of time.
Miguel, we lost your camera.
Really? Okay, that's
your
strange.
Video just went off.
Okay.
I can hear you fine, but
let me restart it, because here it looks like it's turned on.
Well, don't restart, because we don't want to lose the...
Okay. So I'm trying to see if I can turn it off. Hold on. and then turn it back on. Can you see me?
It's a black screen. I can hear you, but I still can't see you.
Okay. Camera off. Okay. Now I'm gonna turn my camera on. It's very strange.
It's a totally black screen. There we go. Now I can see you.
You can see me? Perfect.
Miguel, I have to ask, we've talked about why supplier collaborations programs fail, what can be done to put a solid program in place. But then there we have the data and metrics piece of it. So what metrics should an organization be tracking for their supplier collaboration program?
Okay, so first, that's a very good point. So the first thing is there should be metrics in place. And believe it or not, in most cases, there's no metrics, right? And I always ask, all right, so you're going to implement this, and in 2 years, how do you know you were successful or not? And that's where people start thinking about metrics, right? I think as you're doing or defining your metrics, I think about two things, right? So it's always good to have activity-based metrics, right? So yes, are we meeting with the suppliers? How many summits we did, et cetera, et cetera. I think there's merit in terms of just keeping a pulse on the actual activities that you're doing. But if you have no metrics and you say, what are the key things that we should be putting together, I would completely forget about activity metrics, and I would think about more like the outcomes, right? So you're going to be tempted as a buyer or as a procurement leader to talk about financial metrics. And actually a survey I did said like 60% of companies are doing this, right? And that's all good, but most companies are trying to think about this from a financial benefit because everybody asks about the ROI, right? Why should we collaborate with suppliers otherwise? And to me, financial metrics are very tricky when you talk about supplier collaboration. It's almost if you invest in training, like giving MBAs to all your procurement staff, and then you saved X%, was that because of the training or was that because of other factors? It's very hard to really draw a line between the strategy and the particular financial results. Instead of that, the three things I typically recommend companies tracking are: one, and it could be one of them or the three of them at once, right? But one is doing a voice of the supplier survey where you're actually asking suppliers, what are the things that we're doing right? What are the things we're doing wrong? So they're scoring you for a change and tracking that number. That's very good.
Are you recommending that's a combination of phone, in person, and email, or how are you conducting?
It's usually a survey. So you say here are 15 questions that are going to cover in terms of how expensive are we as a customer, how easy is it to work with us, how skilled are our staff, et cetera, right? So you're collecting almost like an employee engagement kind of survey that hopefully like most companies have in place to figure out how do we keep employees engaged. Very similar, right? You can always complement that with follow-up conversations and things like that, right? But usually coming up with a score in terms of how our suppliers, a big group of suppliers, seeing as a customer, that's a very good indicator in terms of how well they like you, right? This is how close are we to being a customer of choice or how far we are, right? So that's one key thing, and I see a lot of companies incorporating this number into their procurement dashboards, right? So you'll see savings, on-time delivery, etc., and then like almost like a net promoter score from suppliers, almost, right? Like very similar. So that is definitely one of them. The second thing that I typically say, and I would recommend people look at this, is if you're already in the stage where you're tapping into supplier innovation, right? So making sure that you are measuring the outcomes of that innovation program. That like it could be savings, it could be revenue enablement, it could be process efficiencies, right? But if you're a good customer, suppliers are coming to you first with their innovation ideas, right? And if you're a good customer, it means you're doing supplier collaboration, so you can measure that, right? So if you think about financial benefits, that could be a good way of saying, you know what, we got this innovation from suppliers, and that's a metric, right? And the third thing that I see a lot of companies thinking or like implementing is pretty much tracking the performance of the suppliers. And tracking that as part of the health of the supplier collaboration strategy. And when I say performance, again, it's not just on-time delivery, right? So if you have a good strategy, you're going to have a scorecard that includes cost, quality, service, of course, but you also include things like risk, sustainability, like responsiveness. Like it's a very comprehensive scorecard that you're not doing with all of your suppliers, right? But it's something that incorporates all of the needs of the company, not just the operational ones. And then if those scores are improving over time, you can definitely say, yes, we're getting more out of this. And why? Because we're investing time on these suppliers. Those are the top 3 ones that I'm seeing more consistently being used.
And I would argue this is where technology comes into play. If you are already scrapped for resources, you have a limited amount of time and a smaller team, to manually track all of this is really not realistic and reasonable. Yeah. So I think there are things that you can implement or put in place that are very cost effective to help with the metrics piece of it.
Absolutely. And to me, supplier collaboration, like from this perspective, SRM, call it whatever you want, I always say technology is not a key success factor. If you don't have technology, you're doomed. No, but it can definitely help. And it can definitely help from a scaling perspective. And I usually say this because a lot of people are like, we don't have money to invest in this. You don't have to invest. You just have to invest time, put together a strategy, bring some stakeholders, and then just start doing this. You don't have to spend millions on. There's some really nice platforms out there, but you don't need it unless you really want to optimize resources and et cetera, et cetera. But to begin with, you should be fine.
So how do you know if your supplier collaboration program is actually working?
You're going to definitely know when you have the conversations with your suppliers, right? Aside from the metrics that we identified, right? But like in the last 2 years, if you haven't seen a lot of disruptions to your supply chain, you're doing a good job in supplier collaboration, because most companies are. Right. So that's when there's no materials, you can there is capacity out there. There's just like less capacity, and that capacity is going somewhere. And if it's not going to you, it's going to someone else who's actually doing a better job at collaborating with suppliers. Profitability of the suppliers, the price points has a part of it, but also think about this. If you're a supplier, which we tend to often ignore, right? Think about how suppliers feel, right? If you're a supplier, you have a very limited capacity. Who are you going to give it to? The ones who are collaborative, sharing like product roadmaps, the ones where you see a future of growing together, respect you as a supplier, et cetera, or the big guy who, yes, you're selling a lot to them, but they just don't treat you right. And like this, they can change suppliers, right? So you're going to most likely think about the other guys. So.
Thank you for discussing why supplier collaboration strategies fail and what you can do about it today, Miguel. If you have anything to promote or a project that you want our audience to know about, now's the time. So maybe tell us a little bit about what keeps you busy nowadays, and where would you like to send people to find you?
So my LinkedIn profile is very easy. You can reach out by email as well, right? So miguel.cossio@gartner.com. So I actually have a lot on LinkedIn, even though it could be dangerous because I get a lot of people reaching out to sell me stuff and talk to me about all the materials that we're shipping out of Gartner, which we don't ship any materials. So at least you do your homework, right? But definitely by LinkedIn, I'm always looking for companies who are willing to share their success stories with us, right? And it could be a tiny success, like something that you struggled with, that you thought about something like those examples I love, so that we can include in our research, maybe do a webinar with them, things like that, right? So that's one of the biggest things, right? So if you have something interesting to say, by all means, let me know, right? I'm more than happy to connect, learn from that, and see how we can make sure that your story is heard, right, across different audiences. And the second thing is, one of the things that I'm most passionate about is sustainability in procurement, right? So how do we bring sustainability to the way that procurement operates? So every year we are doing a survey in partnership with the Sustainable Procurement Pledge, which is a very interesting organization that I encourage you to check out. You don't have to pay anything. It's just a very large group of people in procurement interested in sustainability. But with them and Gartner, we usually partner every year and we run a survey, right? So if you see that link, by all means, respond to that, because the findings of those studies are not only for Gartner clients, but also for like general public. I just published, you can look me up, I think it was last week, I just published the results. And so it's one of those things that we need people to really take seriously, right? People in procurement take sustainability seriously, right? So by all means, participate there and reach out if you have any questions.
If you missed anything, you can check out the show notes. You can find us by typing in What the Duck, another supply chain podcast in Google. To have the optimal search results, make sure to add another supply chain podcast. To ensure you don't miss a single episode, make sure to follow this podcast and subscribe to us on YouTube. If you are new to the show, make sure to follow this podcast so you don't miss any of our direct materials supply chain content. I'm at Sarah Scudder on LinkedIn and at S. Scudder on Twitter. This brings us to the end of another episode of What the Duck, another supply chain podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Scudder, and we'll be back next week.